"Good-o!" yelled another man as Marines rushed around trying to find more cans of lighter fluid to spray on the hated land crabs. Men started taking orders for cans of lighter fluid and raced off to the 5th Marines PX tent to buy up all they could find. We killed over 100 crabs from my tent alone. One evening after chow, as I sprawled on my cot wishing I were back home, I noticed one of Company K's 2 surviving officers carrying some books and papers down the company street in the twilight. He passed my tent and went to the 55-gallon oil drum that served as a trash can. The lieutenant tossed some maps and papers into the can. He held up a thick book and with obvious anger slammed it into the trash can. He then turned and walked slowly back up the street. Curious, I went out to have a look. The maps were combat maps of Peleliu. I dropped them back into the trash, and have since regretted that I didn't salvage them for future historical reference. Then I found the book. It was a large hardback volume of about 1,000 pages, bound in dark blue, obviously not a GI field manual or book of regulations. Always seeking good reading material, I looked at the spine of the book and read its title, Men at War by Ernest Hemingway. This is interesting history, I thought, and was puzzled as to why the lieutenant had thrown it so violently into the trash. I opened the cover. In the twilight, I saw written in a bold, strong hand, Ea Haldane. A lump rose in my throat as I asked myself why I'd want to read about war when Peleliu had cost us our company commander and so many good friends. I, too, slammed the book down into the trash can in a gesture of grief and disgust over the waste of war I had already experienced firsthand. After we had been back on Pavuvu about a week, I had one of the most heartwarming and rewarding experiences of my entire enlistment in the Marine Corps. It was after taps, all the flambeaux were out, and all of my tent mates were in their sacks with mosquito nets in place. We were all very tired, still trying to unwind from the tension and ordeal of Peleliu. All was quiet, except for someone who had begun snoring softly, when one of the men, a Gloucester veteran who had been wounded on Peleliu, said in steady, measured tones, "You know something, Sledgehammer?" "What?" I answered. "I kinda had my doubts about you," he continued, "and how you'd act when we got into combat, and the stuff hit the fan. I mean, your old man being a doctor, and you having been to college and being sort of a rich kid compared to some guys. But I kept my eye on you on Peleliu, and by God you did okay. You did okay." "Thanks, old buddy," I replied, nearly bursting with pride. Many men were decorated with medals they richly earned for their brave actions in combat, medals to wear on their blouses for everyone to see. I was never awarded an individual decoration, but the simple, sincere personal remarks of approval by my veteran comrade that night after Peleliu were like a medal to me. I have carried them in my heart with great pride and satisfaction ever since. As Christmas approached, rumour had it we were going to have a feast of real turkey. There were several days out of the year when the Marine Corps tried to give us good chow. The 10th of November, the Marine Corps' birthday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. The rest of the time in the Pacific War, chow was canned or dehydrated. Refrigeration facilities for large quantities of food were not available, at least not to a unit as mobile and as lacking in all luxuries as a combat division in the Fleet Marine Force. But the scuttlebutt was that there were frozen turkeys for us in the big refrigerators on Banneker. We had special Christmas Eve church services in the palm-thatched regimental chapel that had been constructed skillfully by Russell Island natives. That was followed by a special Christmas program at the regimental theatre, where we sat on coconut logs and sang carols. I enjoyed it a great deal, but felt pretty homesick. Then we had our roast turkey, and it was excellent. New Year's celebration was even more memorable for me. On New Year's Eve, after chow, I heard some yelling and other commotion over at the battalion mess hall. The messmen had just about finished squaring away the galley for the night when a sentry shouted, "Corporal of the Guard, fire at post number 3! I saw cooks and messmen in the mess hall who were cleaning up by lamplight all rush outside to a fire burning in a grove of trees near the galley. I thought one of the gasoline heaters that boiled water in tubs where we cleaned our mess kits had caught fire. By the light of the flames, I could see men running around the galley yelling, and I could hear the mess sergeant cursing and shouting orders. I also saw 2 figures slide through the shadows toward our company street, but paid them little heed. In a few minutes the fire was put out, just a can of gasoline some distance from the mess hall that had somehow caught fire, somebody said. A friend of mine appeared at my tent and said in a low voice, "Hey, you guys, Howard says come on down to his tent. Plenty of turkey for everybody." We followed him on the double. As I entered the tent, there sat Howard Neese on his cot, a flambeau flickering beside him, and a towel on his lap under a huge, plump roast turkey. "Happy New Year, you guys," Howard said with his characteristically broad grin. We filed past him as he deftly sliced off huge slabs of turkey with his razor-sharp kabar and placed them into our opened hands. Others came in, and we broke out our 2 cans of warm beer that each had been issued. Someone produced a can of jungle juice that had been working. A guitar, a fiddle, and a mandolin struck up the Spanish fandango as Howard sliced turkey until the carcass was cleaned. Then he directed the music, using his kabar as a baton. Howard told us the burning can of gasoline had been merely a diversion to distract the mess sergeant, while he and a couple of other daredevils entered the galley and made a moonlight requisition of 2 turkeys. We, the survivors of that recent bloodbath on Peleliu, forgot our troubles and howled with laughter at the story. Enjoying the comradeship forged by combat, we had the finest New Year's Eve party I've ever attended. The 11th Marines fired an artillery salute at midnight as a peaceful gesture. It was typical of Howard that he pulled off his turkey requisition so neatly, and just as typical that he shared it with as many of his buddies as he could. He was one of those wonderfully buoyant souls, always friendly and joking, cool-headed in combat, and though much admired, very modest. When Howard was killed by a Japanese machine gun in the early days of the Okinawa battle, his 3rd campaign, every man who knew him was deeply saddened. By his example, he taught me more than anyone else the value of cheerfulness in the face of adversity. One of my most treasured memories is the mental picture of Howard Neese sitting on his bunk carving a huge turkey on his lap with his kabar by the light of a flambeau in his tent under Pavuvu's palms on New Year's Eve 1944, grinning and saying, "Happy New Year, Sledgehammer." I profited greatly from knowing him. Our new division commander, Major General Pedro Del Valle, former commander of the 11th Marines, ordered regular close-order drills, parades, and reviews. This was better than work parties moving rotting coconuts and added a spit and polish to our routine that helped morale. A regular beer ration of 2 cans a man each week also helped. During close-order drill, we dressed in clean khakis, which each man pressed under his mattress pad on his canvas bunk. As we marched back and forth on the neat coral-covered parade ground, I thought about home or some book I was reading and wasn't bored at all. One day we had a 5th Regiment parade. Decorations and medals were awarded to those cited for outstanding service on Peleliu. Many of our wounded had returned from the hospitals by then. When the Purple Heart Medal was awarded to those who had been wounded, there weren't many of us who didn't qualify for it. During those parades, we took great pride in seeing our regimental flag carried with us. Like all the regimental flags, it had a large Marine Corps emblem on it with United States Marine Corps emblazoned across the top. Below the emblem was 5th Marine Regiment. But the thing that made our flag unique was the number of battle streamers attached at the top of the staff. These streamers, ribbons about a foot long with the names of battles printed on them, represented battles the 5th Marines had fought in and decorations the regiment had won, all the way back to Belleau Wood, World War I, and the Banana Wars in South America. We had just added Peleliu to the World War II collection. Those streamers represented more battles than any other Marine regiment had fought in. One buddy said our flag had so many battle streamers, decorations and ribbons that it looked like a mop, an unsophisticated yet straight-from-the-shoulder summation of a proud tradition. After we had been back on Pavuvu several weeks, I was told one day to dress in clean khakis and to report to the company headquarters tent promptly at 0100. There was some vague reference to an interview that might lead to officers' candidate school back in the States. "Hey, Sledgehammer, you'll have it made, being an officer and all that, wheeling and dealing stateside," a buddy said as I got ready for the interview. "If you're lucky, maybe you can land a desk job," another said. Some of my buddies were obviously envious as I left and walked nervously down the street. The thoughts in my head were that I didn't want or intend to leave Company K, unless as a casualty or rotated home for good, and why on earth had I been chosen for an interview regarding OCS? When I arrived at the company headquarters, I was sent to a tent a short distance away, near the battalion headquarters. I reported to the tent and was greeted cordially by a first lieutenant. He was an extremely handsome man, and, I gathered from his composure and modest self-confidence, a combat veteran. He asked me in detail about my background and education. He was sincere and friendly. I felt he was trying carefully to determine whether the men he interviewed were suitable to be Marine officers. He and I hit it off well, and I was perfectly honest with him. He asked me why I had not succeeded in the V12 Officers Candidate Program, and I told him how I felt about joining the Marine Corps and being sent to college. "How do you feel about it now that you've been in combat?" he asked. I told him it would be nice to be back in college. I said I had seen enough on Peleliu to satisfy my curiosity and ardour for fighting. "In fact," I said, "I'm ready to go home." He laughed good-naturedly and knowingly. He asked me how I liked the Marine Corps and my unit. I told him I was proud to be a member. He asked me how I liked being a 60mm mortar crewman, and I said it was my first choice. Then he got very serious and asked, "How would you feel about sending men into a situation where you knew they would be killed?" Without hesitation, I answered, "I couldn't do it, sir." The lieutenant looked at me long and hard in a friendly, analytical way. He asked me a few more questions, then said, "Would you like to be an officer?" "Yes, sir, if it meant I could go back to the States," I said. He laughed, and with a few more friendly remarks told me that was all. My buddies asked me for all the details of the interview. When I told them all about it, one said, "Sledgehammer, damn if you ain't got to be as Asiatic as Haney. Why the hell didn't you snow that lieutenant so you could go into OCS?" I replied that the lieutenant was experienced and too wise to fall for a snow job. That was true, of course, but I really had no desire to leave Company K. It was home to me, and I had a strong feeling of belonging to the company no matter how miserable or dangerous conditions might be. Besides, I had found my niche as a mortarman. The weapon and its deployment interested me greatly, and if I had to fight again, I was confident of doing far more damage as a mortarman than as a second lieutenant. I had no desire to be an officer or command anybody. I just wanted to be the best mortar crewman I could, and to survive the war. There was nothing heroic or unique in my attitude. Other men felt the same way. Actually, in combat, our officers caught just as much hell as the enlisted men. They also were burdened with responsibility. As one buddy, a private, said, "When the stuff hits the fan, all I have to do is what I'm told, and I can look out for just me and my buddy. These officers all the time got to be checking maps and squaring people away." We began to assimilate the new replacements into the company, and we added a third mortar to my section. The battalion ordnance section checked all weapons, and we got new issues for those worn out in the fight for Peleliu. There were some drafted Marines among the new replacements, and also a sprinkling of NCOs who had been in Navy yards and other stateside duty stations. The presence of the NCOs caused some bitterness among a few of the Gloucester and Peleliu veterans, who were by then senior in their squads because of the heavy casualties on Peleliu. The latter wouldn't get promoted with new NCOs entering the company to take our leadership positions. From what I saw, however, the new NCOs were mostly men with numerous years of service, although not combat veterans. They did a good job of assuming their authority while respecting us combat veterans for our experience. The drafted Marines took a good bit of kidding about being handcuffed volunteers from those of us who had enlisted into the Marine Corps. Some of the drafted men insisted vehemently that they were volunteers who had enlisted like most of us, but they were careful to conceal their records and identification because SS, for selective service, appeared after the serial number if a man had been drafted. The draftees sometimes had their laugh on us, though. If we griped and complained, they grinned and said, "What you guys moaning about? You asked for it, didn't you?" We just grumbled at them. No one got angry about it. For the most part, the replacements were good men, and the company retained its fighting spirit. Our training picked up in intensity, and rumours began to fly regarding the next blitz, a term commonly used for a campaign. We heard that the 1st Marine Division was to be put into an army to invade the China coast or Formosa, Taiwan. Many of my buddies feared that we would lose our identity as Marines, and that the Marine Corps would finally be absorbed into the US Army, a fate that has caused anxiety to US Marines of many generations, as history well documents. Our training emphasized street fighting and cooperation with tanks in open country. But we still didn't know the name of our objective. After we were shown maps, without names, of a long, narrow island we still didn't know. One day Tom F. Martin, a friend of mine in Company L, who also had been in the V-12 program and was a Peleliu veteran, came excitedly to my tent and showed me a National Geographic map of the Northern Pacific. On it we saw the same oddly shaped island. Located 325 miles south of the southern tip of the Japanese home island of Kyushu, it was called Okinawa Shima. Its closeness to Japan assured us of one thing beyond any doubt. Whatever else happened, the battle for Okinawa was bound to be bitter and bloody. The Japanese never had sold any island cheaply, and the pattern of the war until then had shown that the battles became more vicious the closer we got to Japan. We made practice landings, fired various small arms, and underwent intensive mortar training. With a third weapon added to our mortar section, I felt as though we were Company K's artillery battery. At this time, hepatitis broke out among the troops. We called it yellow jaundice, and I got a bad case. We could look at a man and tell whether he had the malady by the yellowing of the whites of his eyes. Even our deeply tanned skins took on a sallow appearance. I felt terrible, was tired, and the smell of food nauseated me. Pavuvu's muggy heat didn't help either. I went to sick call one morning, as other Marines were doing in increasing numbers. The medical officer gave me a light-duty slip, a piece of paper officially relieving me from the intense exertion of routine training, but still making me subject to minor work parties such as picking up trash, straightening tent ropes, and the like. It was the only time during my entire service in the Marine Corps that I got out of regular duties because of illness. Had we been civilians, I'm confident those of us with hepatitis would have been hospitalized. Instead, we received APC pills from a corpsman. This medication was the standard remedy for everything except bayonet, gunshot, or shrapnel wounds. After several days, I was pronounced recovered enough for resumption of regular duties, and surrendered my cherished light-duty slip to an officer in sick bay. Training intensified. During January 1945, the company boarded an LCI+, and in convoy with other such vessels, went to Guadalcanal for manoeuvres. After a division-sized field problem, we returned to Pavuvu on the 25th of January. Then we listened daily with sympathetic interest to the news reports of the terrible fighting encountered by the 3D, 4th and 5th Marine Divisions during the battle for Iwo Jima that began on the 19th of February. "It sounds just like a larger version of Peleliu," a buddy of mine said one day. He didn't realize how correct he was. The new pattern of defense in depth and no banzai charges that the Japanese had tried on the 1st Marine Division at Peleliu was repeated on Iwo Jima. When that island was declared secured on the 16th of March, the cost to the 3 Marine divisions that fought there sounded like our Peleliu casualties magnified 3 times. During our training, we were told that we would have to climb over a seawall or cliff, exact height unknown, to move inland during the coming battle. Several times we practiced scaling a sheer coral cliff, about 40 feet high, across the bay from the division's camp on Pavuvu. We had no more than 2 ropes to get the entire company up and over the cliff. Supposedly we would be furnished rope ladders before D-Day, but I never saw any. While we stood at the foot of the cliff during those exercises, waiting our turn and watching other men struggle up the ropes to the top of the cliff with all their combat gear, I heard some choice comments from my buddies regarding the proceedings. The company officers, all new except First Lieutenant Stanley, the CO, were rushing around with great enthusiasm, urging the troops up the cliff like it was some sort of college football training routine. What a fouled-up bunch of boot lieutenants if I ever saw any. Just what the hell do they think them Japanese are going to be doing while we climb up that cliff one at a time? Grumbled a veteran machine gunner. Seems pretty stupid to me. If that beach is anything like Peleliu, we'll get picked off before anybody gets up any cliff, I said. You said that right, Sledgehammer, and the Japanese ain't going to be sitting around on their cans. They're going to bracket that beach with mortars and artillery, and machine guns are going to sweep the top of that cliff, he said with melancholy resignation. Our new mortar section leader was a New Englander out of an Ivy League college. Mac was blonde, not large, but was well-built, energetic and talkative, with a broad New England accent. He was a conscientious officer, but he irritated the veterans by talking frequently and at great length about what he was going to do to the Japanese when we went into action again. We sometimes heard such big talk from enlisted replacements who were trying to impress someone, mostly themselves, with how brave they would be under fire, but Mac was about the only officer I ever heard indulge in it. Whenever he got started with, "The first time one of our guys gets hit, it's going to make me so mad that I'm going to take my kabar between my teeth and my .45 in my hand and charge the Japanese," all the veterans would sit back and smirk. We threw knowing glances at each other and rolled our eyes like disgusted schoolboys listening to a coach brag that he could lick the opposing team single-handed. I felt embarrassed for Mac because it was so obvious he conceived combat as a mixture of football and a Boy Scout campout. He wouldn't listen to the few words of caution from some of us who suggested he had a shock coming. I agreed with a buddy from Texas who said, "I hope to God that big-mouth Yankee lieutenant has to eat every one of them words when the stuff hits the fan." The Texans' wish came true on Okinawa, and it was one of the funniest things I ever saw under fire. Before the next campaign, we had to take the usual inoculations plus some additional ones. Our arms were sore, and many men became feverish. The troops hated getting injections, and the large number, someone said it was 7, before Okinawa made us crotchety. The plague shot burned like fire and was the worst. Most of our corpsmen did a good job of making the shots as painless as possible, and this helped. But we had one arrogant corpsman who was unfeeling about other people's pain. He wasn't popular, to say the least. I hasten to add that he was the one and only U.S. Navy hospital corpsman I knew in the Marine Corps who didn't conduct himself in an exemplary manner. All other corpsmen I saw were probably more highly respected by Marines, as a group and as individuals, than any other group of people we were involved with. Directly in front of me as we lined up for shots was a buddy who was a Peleliu veteran. In front of him were several new replacements. The more new men, Doc Arrogant, stuck with the needle, the worse he became. He was just plain mean by the time he got to my buddy. Doc Arrogant was in a hurry and didn't look up to recognize my buddy as the latter stepped up to the table. It nearly cost Doc dearly. He held the needle like a dart, plunged it into my friend's arm, depressed the plunger, and said, "Move out." My friend didn't flinch from the painful shot. He turned slowly, shook his fist in the corpsman's face, and said, "You, if you want to do some bayonet practice, I'll meet you out on the bayonet course with fixed bayonets and no scabbards on the blades, and then see what you can do." Doc Arrogant looked shocked. He was speechless when he realized that the arm he had punctured so roughly wasn't attached to a meek replacement, but to a seasoned veteran. Then my friend said, "If you ever give me another shot like that, I'll grab you by the stacking swivel and beat you down to parade rest. I'll whip your ass so bad you won't even be able to make this next blitz, because they'll have to award you a Purple Heart when I finish with you, wise guy." Doc Arrogant changed instantly into Doc Meek. When I stepped up for my shot, he administered it with a gentleness that would have done credit to Florence Nightingale. We started packing up our gear. Soon we got word that we would have more manoeuvres on Guadalcanal, then shove off for our next fight, Okinawa. This is a naval slang word referring either to water coolers aboard ship or to rumours. Perhaps the double meaning derived from a habit of sailors and marines of swapping rumours when gathered around a water cooler for a drink. a non-prescription, all-purpose painkiller containing aspirin and caffeine, among other ingredients. Landing craft, infantry, a sort of miniature LST that carried about a company of infantry, plus a few vehicles. From the standpoint of personal satisfaction, I've always been glad that as long as we had to pull manoeuvres somewhere in preparation for Peleliu and Okinawa, this training took place on Guadalcanal. The name of that island was embroidered in white letters down the red number 1 on our division patch, of which we were all very proud. Guadalcanal had great symbolic significance. I was glad I got to see some of the areas fought over by the 1st Marine Division during the campaign, and got some first-hand accounts on the spot of what had taken place from veterans who had participated in making that history. During one period of manoeuvres on Guadalcanal, we stayed ashore for 2 or 3 weeks and bivouacked in an area that had been the camp of the 3D Marine Division before its troops went into the hell of Iwo Jima. We strung our jungle hammocks and made ourselves as comfortable as possible. Each day for several days we went out into the hills, jungles and kunai grass fields for training, and we enjoyed a cool shower each afternoon after coming in from the field. Guadalcanal was a big base by early 1945 and had many service troops and rear echelon units on it. Across the road from us was a battalion of Seabees, Naval Construction Battalion. Late one afternoon, 3 or 4 of us went over and eased quietly into the end of their chow line. Their cooks recognized us as Marines, but didn't say anything. We loaded up on real ice cream, fresh pork chops, fresh salad and good bread, all unheard-of delicacies on Pavuvu, and sat at a clean table in a spacious mess hall. It sure beat sea rations in a bivouac area. As intruders, we expected to be thrown out any minute. No one seemed to notice us, though. Next afternoon we returned along with other Marines who had the same idea and enjoyed another excellent supper. Next day we tried it again, easing quietly and slowly along to the chow line, trying not to attract attention. To my amazement, a large, neatly painted white sign with blue letters and blue border had been placed above the entrance to the chow line since the previous evening. I don't remember the exact wording, but it went something close to this: Marines welcomed in this chow line after all CB personnel have been through. We were as embarrassed as we were delighted. Those Seabees had been fully aware of us all along and knew exactly how many Marines were slipping into their chow line, but they were willing and glad to share their extra chow with us as long as it lasted. The sign was necessary because the Seabees knew we would spread the word, and more hungry Marines would swarm over their chow line each day like ants. We were elated and went through the chow line grinning and thanking the messmen. They were the friendliest bunch I ever saw, and made us feel like adopted orphans. The sign may have been made earlier for 3D Division Marines, who liked the Seabees food as much as we, or it may have been put up for our benefit. In any event, we appreciated the good food and good treatment. It strengthened our respect for the Seabees. The 3D Battalion, 5th Marines, had been in the assault waves at Peleliu. Therefore, in the Okinawa campaign, we were assigned as regimental reserve. For the voyage to the island, consequently, we would be loaded aboard the attack transport ship USS McCracken instead of LSTs. Such APA transports sent troops ashore in LCVPs, small open landing craft known as Higgins boats, rather than amphibious tractors. One afternoon, following landing exercises and field problems, our company returned to the beach to await the return of the Higgins boats that would pick us up and return us to the ship. Late afternoon sunlight danced on the beautiful blue waves, and a large fleet of ships stood offshore in Sea Lark Channel. Dozens of Higgins boats and other amphibious craft plied from the ships to shore, loading Marines and ferrying them out to the ships. It looked like some sort of boating festival, except that all the craft were military. One by one, the Higgins boats picked up men, about 25 at a time, from our beach area. We waited as the sun sank low in the west. The ships formed up in convoy and moved past us, parallel to the beach. We had no rations or extra water, were tired from day-long manoeuvres, and had no desire to spend the night on a mosquito-infested beach. Finally, as the last ship showed us its stern, a Higgins boat came ploughing through the spray toward us. We were the only troops left on the beach. The coxswain revved his engine, ran the bow of the shallow draft boat up on the beach, and dropped the bow ramp with a bang. We clambered aboard, and someone yelled the customary, "Shove off, coxswain, you're loaded." We held on to the bulwarks of the boat as he raised the ramp, reversed engines, turned, and headed out at full throttle toward the disappearing ship. The sea was rough. As usual, Snafu started getting seasick, so he lay down on his side on the deck of the boat. We were crowded. 2 machine gun squads and 2 60mm mortar squads packed the Higgins boat, along with all our combat gear, small arms, mortars and machine guns. A Higgins boat, like any powerful motor-driven boat under full throttle, normally settled down at the stern end with bow elevated and moved easily over the water. But our boat was so loaded with men and equipment that even though we crowded as far back in the stern as possible, the squared-off bow ramp wasn't elevated sufficiently to skip over the waves. It drove straight against some large waves, and water poured in through an open-view port. Usually this 3-foot by 2-foot panel rode well above water level. The coxswain yelled instructions to close the folding steel shutters on the panel, which we did as quickly as possible. But water still sprayed over the bow ramp and in through the cracks around the panel. In the gathering twilight, we could see the stern of a transport far ahead of us. It was the last ship in the convoy that had passed from view around the end of Guadalcanal. Our coxswain made as much speed as possible to catch the transport, and we shipped more and more water. If we didn't catch up with that transport before dark, we didn't know when we would get back to our ship. Water began filling the bilges below the floor decking, so the coxswain started the pumps to keep us afloat. We stood by to bail with our helmets, but by the time the water rose above the flooring where we could get at it, the boat would probably sink because of its heavy load. The situation was grim, and I dreaded the thought of trying to swim the couple of miles through rough water to the beach. What irony, I thought, if some of us should die after surviving Peleliu by drowning on manoeuvres in Iron Bottom Bay. Slowly we gained on the transport and finally drew alongside. Towering above us, the ship was packed with Marines. We shouted up to them for help. A Navy officer leaned over the rail and asked us which ship we were from. We told him we had missed the McCracken and requested to come aboard or we might sink. He gave orders to our coxswain to pull in close under a pair of davits. He did so, and 2 cables with hooks were lowered to us. Just as the hooks were fastened to rings in the floor, our Higgins boat seemed to start sinking. Only the cables held it up. A cargo net was lowered to us, and we scrambled up and aboard the ship. We were all mighty relieved to be out of that small boat. Several hours after dark, the ship arrived at the fleet anchorage. A signalman on the bridge went to work with his blinker light, sending code to other ships. The McCracken was located, and we were soon back aboard. "Where the hell have you guys been so long?" asked a man in my troop compartment as we fell into our racks. "We went to Frisco for a beer," someone answered. "Wise guy," he replied. After manoeuvres were completed, our convoy sailed from the Russell Islands on the 15th of March 1945. We were bound for Ulithi Atoll, where the convoy would join the gathering invasion fleet. We anchored off Ulithi on the 21st of March and remained there until the 27th of March. We lined the rails of our transport and looked out over the vast fleet in amazement. We saw ships of every description, huge new battleships, cruisers, sleek destroyers, and a host of fast escort craft. Aircraft carriers were there in greater numbers than any of us had ever seen before. Every conceivable type of amphibious vessel was arrayed. It was the biggest invasion fleet ever assembled in the Pacific, and we were awed by the sight of it. Because of tides and winds, the ships swung about on their anchor chains, and each day the fleet looked new and different. When I came topside each morning, I felt disoriented. It was a strange sensation, as though I were in a different frame of reference and had to learn my surroundings anew. The first afternoon at Ulithi, a fellow Mortarman said, "Break out the field glasses, and let's see how many kinds of ships we can identify." We passed the mortar section's field glasses around, and whiled away many hours studying the different ships. Suddenly someone gasped, "Look over there at that hospital ship off our port bow! Look at them nurses! Gimme them field glasses!" Lining the rail of the hospital ship were about a dozen American nurses looking out over the fleet. A scuffle erupted among us over who would use the field glasses first, but we all finally had a look at the girls. We whistled and waved, but we were too far away to be heard. Aside from the huge new battleships and carriers, we talked most about a terribly scorched and battered aircraft carrier anchored near us. A Navy officer told us she was the Franklin. We could see charred and twisted aircraft on her flight deck, where they had been waiting loaded with bombs and rockets to take off when the ship was hit. It must have been a flaming inferno of bursting bombs and rockets and burning aviation gasoline. We looked silently at the battered, listing hulk until one man said, "Ain't she a mess? Boy, them poor swabbies must have caught hell." Those of us who had lived through the blast and fire of Peleliu's artillery barrages could appreciate well the bravery of the sailors on the Franklin. While we were anchored at Ulithi, we went ashore on the tiny islet of Mogmog for recreation and physical conditioning. After some calisthenics, and to the delight of all hands, our officers broke out warm beer and cokes. We had one of the most enjoyable baseball games I ever played. Everybody was laughing and running like a bunch of little boys. It was good to get off the cramped transport, stretch our legs, and relieve the monotony. We hated to board the Higgins boats at sunset to return to the ship and our cramped quarters. At Ulithi, we received briefings on the coming battle for Okinawa. This time there was no promise of a short operation. "This is expected to be the costliest amphibious campaign of the war," a lieutenant said. "We will be hitting an island about 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, so you can expect them to fight with more determination than ever. We can expect 80 to 85% casualties on the beach." A buddy next to me leaned over and whispered, "How's that for boosting the troops' morale?" I only groaned. The lieutenant continued, "We may have trouble getting over that cliff or seawall in our sector. Also, according to G2, there is a large Japanese gun, maybe 150 mm, emplaced just on the right flank of our battalion sector. We hope naval gunfire can knock it out. Be on the alert for a Japanese paratrooper attack in our rear, particularly at night. It's pretty certain the Japanese will pull off a massive counterattack, probably supported by tanks, sometime during our first night ashore or just before dawn. They'll banzai and try to push us off the beachhead." On the 27th of March, the loudspeaker came on with, "Now hear this, now hear this. Special Sea Detail, stand by." Sailors assigned to the detail moved to their stations where they weighed anchor. "Well, Sledgehammer, they're raising the hook, so it won't be long before we're in it again, old buddy," a friend said. "Yeah," I said, "and I'm not in any hurry either." "You can say that again." He sighed. The huge convoy got underway like clockwork. Just watching that host of different vessels kept my mind off what was ahead. As we proceeded, I was conscious of how cool the weather had become. We had our wool-lined field jackets with us, and it was comfortable on deck, particularly at night. To those of us who had lived and fought in the sweltering tropics for months, cooler weather was very significant. Most of our voyage from Ulithi was uneventful. Each night during the northward trip, I had noticed the beautiful Southern Cross constellation slipping lower and lower on the starlit horizon. Finally, it disappeared. It was the only thing about the South and Central Pacific I would miss. The Southern Cross formed a part of our 1st Marine Division shoulder patch, and was, therefore, especially symbolic. We had intense pride in the identification with our units, and drew considerable strength from the symbolism attached to them. As we drew closer to Okinawa, the knowledge that I was a member of Company K, 3D Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division helped me prepare myself for what I knew was coming. Okinawa is a large island, some 60 miles long and from 2 to 18 miles wide. Like most islands in the Pacific, it is surrounded by a coral reef. But on the west coast, that reef lies close to shore, particularly along the invasion beaches at Hagushi. Through the center of the island runs a ridge rising some 1,500 feet in the wild, mountainous north. South of the Ishikawa Isthmus, the land levels out considerably, but is cut by several prominent streams. In 1945, as it remains today, the southern portion of the island contained the bulk of the civilian population. Of primary importance to the defence of the island were three east-west ridge systems crossing the southern part of the island. To the north and just below the invasion beaches lay the ridges of Kakazu and Nishibaru. In the middle, running west from Shuri Castle, was the most formidable of the ridges, cut by sheer cliffs and deep draws. Above the extreme southern tip of the island lay Kunishi, Yusadake, and Yaijudake. Together, these ridges formed a series of natural defensive barriers to the American forces advancing from the north. Into these natural barriers, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima threw the bulk of his 110,000-man 32nd Japanese Army. Natural and man-made barriers were transformed into a network of mutually supporting positions linked by a system of protected tunnels. Each of the ridge lines was held in great strength until it became untenable. Then the enemy withdrew to the next defence line. Thus the Japanese drew on their experiences at Peleliu, Saipan, and Iwajima to construct a highly sophisticated and powerful defence in depth. There they waited and fought to exhaust the will and the resources of the American 10th Army. Tension mounted on the eve of D-Day. We received final orders to move in off the beach as fast as possible. We were also reminded that although we were in regimental reserve, we would probably get the hell kicked out of us coming on the beach. We were advised to hit the sack early. We would need all the rest we could get. A pre-dawn reveille ushered in Easter Sunday, April Fool's Day, 1945. The ship seethed with activity. We had chow of steak and eggs, the usual feast before the slaughter. I returned to our troop compartment and squared away my ammunition, combat pack, and mortar ammunition bag. The ship's crew manned battle stations and stood by to repel kamikaze attacks. Dawn was breaking, and the pre-assault bombardment of the beaches had begun. Above it, I could hear the drone of enemy aircraft inbound to the attack. I went into the head to relieve my distressed colon, cramped by fear and apprehension. On the big transport ships, the toilet facilities consisted of a row of permanent wooden seats situated over a metal trough through which ran a constant flow of seawater. There were about 20 seats, no limited facilities here with Haney to delay us as at Peleliu. Most of the men in my troop compartment had already been to the head, and by then had donned their gear and moved out on deck, so I was about the last one in the head. I settled comfortably on a seat. Next to me I noticed a cage-like chute of iron mesh coming through the overhead ceiling near one of the 40 mm anti-aircraft gun tubs. It extended down, through the deck, and into the compartment below. Startled out of my wits by an incredibly loud sound of clattering, clanking, scraping, and rasping metal, I sprang up with a reflex born of fear and tried to bolt out of the head into the troop compartment. I knew a kamikaze had crashed into our ship right above me. My trousers around my ankles hobbled me, and I nearly fell. As I reached to pull them up, the loud clanking and clattering, like 1,000 cymbals falling down stone steps, continued. I looked over at the iron mesh chute and saw dozens of empty brass 40 mm shell cases cascading down from the guns above. They clattered and clanged through the chute to some collecting bin below decks. My fright subsided into chagrin. I got on my gear and joined the other men on deck to await orders. We milled around, each man sticking close to his buddy. Higgins' boats would take us to rendezvous areas and transfer us to Amtraks that previously had delivered the assault waves of infantry across the reef to the beach. The bombardment of the beach by our warships had grown in intensity, and our planes had joined in with strafing, rockets, and bombing. Japanese planes flew over the fleet at some distance from us. Many of our ships were firing at them. An order came for all troops to go below. This was to prevent casualties from strafing enemy planes. Loaded with our battle gear, we squeezed our way back through the door like hatches into our compartment. Packed like sardines in the aisles between the racks, we waited in the compartment for orders to move back on deck. Sailors on deck dogged our hatches, sealed the doors by turning U-shaped handles positioned all around them. Like men locked in a closet, we waited and listened to the firing outside. The compartment wasn't large, and the air soon became foul. It was difficult to breathe. Although the weather was cool, we began to sweat. "Hey, you guys, the blowers! Electric ventilating fans are off. By God, we'll smother in this damn place," yelled one man. I was next to the hatch, and several of us started yelling at the sailors outside, telling them we needed air. They yelled back from the other side of the steel door that it couldn't be helped, because the electricity was needed to operate the gun mounts. "Then, by God, let us out on deck." "Sorry, we've got orders to keep this hatch dogged down." We all started cursing the sailors, but they were following orders, and I'm sure they didn't want to keep us locked in that stuffy compartment. "Let's get the hell out of here," a buddy said. We all agreed it would be better to get strafed on deck than to suffocate in the compartment. Grasping the levers and moving them to the unlock position, we tried to open the hatch. As fast as we turned each lever, the sailors outside turned it back and kept it dogged down. Other desperate Marines joined us in trying to unclamp the hatch. There were only 2 sailors outside, so with our combined efforts, we finally got all the clamps open, shoved open the hatch, and burst out into the cool, fresh air. About that time, other Company K men poured out of a hatch on the other side of the compartment. One of the sailors got pushed over and rolled across the deck. In an instant, we were all outside, breathing in the fresh air. "All right, you men, return to your quarters. No troops topside. That's an order," came a voice from a platform slightly aft and above us. We looked up and saw a Navy officer, an ensign, standing against the rail glaring at us. He wore khakis, an officer's cap, and insignia bars on his collar, in stark contrast to us dressed in green dungarees, tan canvas leggings, and camouflaged helmet covers, and loaded with battle equipment, weapons, and gear. He wore a web pistol belt with a .45 automatic in the holster. None of our officers was in the area, so the Navy ensign had it all to himself. He swaggered back and forth, ordering us into the foul air of the troop compartment. If he had been a Marine officer, we would have obeyed his order with mutterings and mumblings, but he was so unimposing that we just milled around. Finally, he began threatening us all with court-martial if we didn't obey him. A friend of mine spoke up. "Sir, we're going to hit that beach in a little while, and a lot of us might not be alive an hour from now. We'd rather take a chance on getting hit by a Japanese plane out here than go back in there and smother to death." The officer spun around and headed for the bridge. To get help, we assumed. Shortly, some of our own officers came up and told us to stand by to go down the nets to the waiting boats. As far as I know, our breakout of the troop compartment for fresh air was never mentioned. We picked up our gear and moved to assigned areas along the bulwarks of the ship. The weather was mostly clear and incredibly cool, about 75 degrees, after the heat of the South Pacific. The bombardment rumbled and thundered towards the island. Everything from battleships down to rocket and mortar boats were plastering the beaches along with our dive bombers. Japanese planes, their engines droning and whining, came in over the huge convoy, and many ships' anti-aircraft fire began bursting in the air. I saw 2 enemy planes get hit some distance from our ship. We were all tense, particularly with the intelligence estimate that we could expect 85% casualties on the beach. Although I was filled with dread about the landing, I wasn't nearly so apprehensive as I had been at Peleliu. Perhaps it was because I was already a combat veteran. I had survived the Peleliu landing and knew what to expect from the Japanese, as well as from myself. Climbing down the cargo net to the Higgins boat, I was still afraid, but it was different from Peleliu. In addition to the invaluable experience of being a combat veteran, the immensity of our fleet gave me courage. Combat vessels and armed transports ranged as far as we could see. I have no idea how many of our planes were in the air, but it must have been hundreds. We climbed down the net and settled into the Higgins boat. Someone said, "Shove off, coxswain, you're loaded," as the last Marine climbed into our boat. The coxswain gunned the engine and pulled away from the ship. Other boats loaded with Marines from 3-5 were pulling out all along the side of the ship. I sure hated to leave it. Amphibious craft of every description floated on the water around us. The complexity of the huge invasion was evident everywhere we looked. Our boat ran some distance from our ship, then began circling slowly in company with other boats loaded with men from our battalion. The bombardment of the Hagushi beaches roared on with awesome intensity. Sitting low in the water, we really couldn't see what was going on, except in our immediate vicinity. We waited nervously for H-hour, which was scheduled for 0830. Some of the ships began releasing thick white smoke as a screen for the convoy's activity. The smoke drifted lazily and mingled in with that of the exploding shells. We continued to circle on the beautiful blue water made choppy by the other boats in our group. "It's 0830 now," someone said. "The first wave's going in now. Stand by for a ram," Snafu said. The man next to me sighed. "Yeah, the stuff's going to hit the fan now." Ulithi Atoll lies about 260 miles northeast of Peleliu, on the western edge of the Caroline Islands. It was captured by an element of the 81st Infantry Division as a part of the Palau Islands operation. Ulithi consists of about 30 islets surrounding an enormous lagoon some 19 miles long and 5 to 10 miles wide. It became the major U.S. fleet anchorage in the Central Pacific. During carrier raids on Japan, 21st of March, Japanese suicide planes had crashed into the American carriers Wasp, Yorktown, and Franklin. The Franklin was the most heavily damaged of the three. Her loss was 724 killed and 265 wounded. That the ship was saved at all, and later towed some 12,000 miles to New York for repairs, was a tribute to the bravery and the skill of her crew. By this time in the Pacific War, official unit designations recognized the prevailing system of task organization for combat, where supporting elements reinforced the infantry. Such units became Regimental Combat Teams, RCT, and Battalion Landing Teams, BLT. Hence, official designations were 5th RCT or 3D BLT. But the rank-and-file infantryman never forgot who he was. Throughout the war, I never heard a Marine infantryman refer to his unit by other than its base name. We were always K/35, 3D Battalion, 5th, or 5th Marines. Our planners still hadn't realized that this costly large-scale suicide charge tactic had been abandoned for good. The Japanese had shifted to the defense-in-depth tactic as the best means of defeating us. This tactical shift had prolonged our fight on Peleliu, and had been repeated with the same murderous results against the Marines on Iwo Jima. 3-5 was scheduled to land after the 1st and 2D battalions of the 5th Marines on the extreme right of the regimental beach. It would form the right flank of the 3 Marine Amphibious Corps and link with the U.S. Army's 24 Corps landing to the south. Manned suicide planes that dived into American ships. Faith in the kamikazes' divine wind ability to cut off the American fleet's support of the landing force ashore was an important element in the Japanese defensive scheme. Stay of execution. The landing is unopposed. We looked with amazement at the Marine on the Amtrak with which our Higgins boat had just hooked up. "The hell you say?" one of my buddies shot back. "It's straight dope. I ain't seen no casualties. Most of the Japanese must have hauled ass. I just saw a couple of mortar shells falling in the water, that's all. The guys went in standing up. It beats anything I ever saw." Images of the maelstrom at Peleliu had been flashing through my mind, but on Okinawa there was practically no opposition to the landing. When we overcame our astonishment, everybody started laughing and joking. The release of tension was unforgettable. We sat on the edge of the Amtrak's troop compartment, singing and commenting on the vast fleet surrounding us. No need to crouch low to avoid the deadly shrapnel and bullets. It was, and still is, the most pleasant surprise of the war. It suddenly dawned on me, though, that it wasn't at all like the Japanese to let us walk ashore unopposed on an island only 350 miles from their homeland. They were obviously pulling some trick, and I began to wonder what they were up to. "Hey, Sledgehammer, what's the matter? Why don't you sing like everybody else?" I grinned and took up the chorus of the Little Brown Jug. "That's more like it." As our wave moved closer to the island, we got a good view of the hundreds of landing boats and Amtraks approaching the beach. Directly ahead of us, we could see the men of our regiment moving about in dispersed combat formations, like tiny toy soldiers on the rising landscape. They appeared unhurried and nonchalant, as if on manoeuvres. There were no enemy shells bursting among them. The island sloped up gently from the beach, and the many small garden and farm plots of the Okinawans gave it the appearance of a patchwork quilt. It was beautiful, except where the ground cover and vegetation had been blasted by shells. I was overcome with the contrast to D-Day on Peleliu. When our wave was about 50 yards from the beach, I saw 2 enemy mortar shells explode a considerable distance to our left. They spewed up small geysers of water, but caused no damage to the Amtraks in that area. That was the only enemy fire I saw during the landing on Okinawa. It made the April Fool's Day aspect even more sinister, because all those thousands of first-rate Japanese troops on that island had to be somewhere spoiling for a fight. We continued to look at the panorama around our Amtrak with no thought of immediate danger as we came up out of the water. The tailgate banged down. We calmly picked up our gear and walked onto the beach. A short distance down the beach on our right, the mouth of Bishigawa emptied into the sea. This small river formed the boundary between the army divisions of the Tuator Corps to the south and the 3 amphibious corps to the north of the river. On our side of the mouth of the river, on a promontory jutting out into the sea, I saw the remains of the emplacement containing the big Japanese gun that had concerned us in our briefings. The seawall in our area had been blasted down into a terrace-like rise a few feet high, over which we moved with ease. We advanced inland, and I neither heard nor saw any Japanese fire directed against us. As we moved across the small fields and gardens onto higher elevations, I could see troops of the 6th Marine Division heading toward the big Yontan airfield on our left. Jubilation over the lack of opposition to the landing prevailed, particularly among the Peleliu veterans. Our new replacements began making remarks about amphibious landings being easy. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., USA, commanded the 10th Army in the assault against Okinawa. Left north of the American landing was the 3 Marine Amphibious Corps led by Major General Roy S. Geiger, which consisted of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, with the latter on the left. To the right, south, landed the Army's 24 Corps, commanded by Major General John R. Hodge, and made up of the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions, with the latter on the far right. Backing up the 24 Corps was the 77th Infantry Division, with the 27th Infantry Division afloat in reserve. Across the island stood the 2D Marine Division, which had conducted an elaborate full-scale feint at the southeastern beaches. Altogether, Lieutenant General Buckner had 541,866 men at his disposal. Of the 50,000 troops ashore on D-Day, the 4 assault divisions lost only 28 killed, 104 wounded, and 27 missing. The plan of attack called for the 4 divisions to cross the island, cutting it in 2. The Marines would then turn left and move north to secure the upper 2/3 of the island, while the Army forces wheeled right into line and proceeded south. By late afternoon on D-Day, we were ordered to dig in for the night. My squad set up in a small field of recently harvested grain. The clay loam soil was just right for digging in, so we made a good gun pit. Our company's other 2 mortars were positioned nearby. We registered in on likely target areas to our front with a couple of rounds of HE, then squared away our ammo for the night. Everybody was expecting a big counterattack with tanks because of the open nature of the countryside. Once set up, several of us went over to the edge of the field and cautiously explored a neat, clean Okinawan farmhouse. It was a likely hiding place for snipers, but we found it empty. As we were leaving the house to return to our positions, Jim Dandridge, one of our replacements, stepped on what appeared to be a wooden cover over an underground rainwater cistern at the corner of the house. Jim was a big man, and the wooden planks were rotten. He fell through, sinking in above his waist. The hole wasn't a cistern, but a cesspool for the sewage from the house. Jim scrambled out bellowing like a mad bull and smelling worse. We all knew it might be weeks before we could get a change of dungarees, so it was no laughing matter to Jim. But we started kissing him unmercifully about his odd taste in swimming holes. Jim was good-natured, but he quickly had enough and chased a couple of the men back across the field to our positions. They laughed but kept out of his reach. No sooner had we gotten back to our foxholes than we heard the unmistakable drone of a Japanese aircraft engine. We looked up and saw a Zero coming directly over us. The fighter was high, and the pilot apparently had bigger game than us in mind. He headed out over the beach toward our fleet offshore. Several ships began firing furiously as he circled lazily and then dove. The plane's engine began to whine with increasing intensity as the kamikaze pilot headed straight down toward a transport. We saw the smoke where he hit the ship, but it was so far away we couldn't determine what damage had been done. The troops had debarked earlier, but the ship's crew probably had a rough time of it. It was the first kamikaze I had seen crash into a ship, but it wasn't the last. In the gathering dusk, we turned our attention to our immediate surroundings and squared away for the night. We each had been issued a small bottle containing a few ounces of brandy to ward off the chill of D-Day night. Knowing my limited taste, appreciation, and capacity for booze, my buddies began trying to talk me out of my brandy ration. But I was cold after sundown and thought the brandy might warm me up a bit. I tried a sip, concluding immediately that Indians must have had brandy in mind when they supposedly spoke of firewater. I traded my brandy for a can of peaches, then broke out my wool-lined field jacket and put it on. It felt good. We waited in the clear, chilly night for the expected Japanese attack. But all was quiet, with no artillery fire nearby, and rarely any rifle or machine gun fire. Stark contrast to the rumbling, crashing chaos of D-Day night on Peleliu. When Snafu woke me about midnight for my turn on watch, he handed me our Tommy submachine gun. I don't remember how, where, or when we got the Tommy gun, but Snafu and I took turns carrying it and the mortar throughout Peleliu and Okinawa. A pistol was fine, but limited at close range, so we valued our Tommy greatly. After a few minutes on watch, I noticed what appeared to be a man crouching near me at the edge of a line of shadows cast by some trees. I strained my eyes, averted my vision, and looked in all directions, but I couldn't be sure the dark object was a man. The harder I looked, the more convinced I was. I thought I could make out a Japanese fatigue cap. It wasn't a Marine, because none of our people was placed where the figure was. It was probably an enemy infiltrator waiting for his comrades to get in place before acting. I couldn't be sure in the pale light. Should I fire or take a chance? My teeth began to chatter from the chill and the jitters. I raised the Tommy slowly, set it on full automatic, flipped off the safety, and took careful aim at the lower part of the figure. I mustn't fire over his head when the Tommy recoiled. I squeezed the trigger for a short burst of several rounds. Flames spurted out of the muzzle, and the rapid explosions of the cartridges shattered the calm. I peered confidently over my sights, expecting to see a Japanese knocked over by the impact of the big .45 caliber slugs. Nothing happened. The enemy didn't move. Everyone around us began whispering, "What's the dope? What did you see?" I answered that I thought I had seen a Japanese crouching near the shadows. There were enemy in the area, for just then we heard shouts in Japanese, a high-pitched yell, "Nippon Banzai!" Then incoherent babbling, followed by a burst of firing from one of our machine guns. Quiet fell. When dawn broke, the first dim light revealed my infiltrator to be a low stack of straw. My buddies kidded me for hours about a Peleliu veteran firing at a straw Japanese. On the 2nd of April, D+1, the 1st Marine Division continued its attack across the island. We moved out with our planes overhead, but without artillery fire, because no organized body of Japanese had been located ahead of us. Everyone was asking the same question: where the hell are the Japanese? Some scattered small groups were encountered and put up a fight, but the main Japanese army had vanished. During the morning, I saw a couple of dead enemy soldiers who apparently had been acting as observers in a large leafless tree when some of the pre-landing bombardment killed them. One still hung over a limb. His intestines were strung out among the branches like garland decorations on a Christmas tree. The other man lay beneath the tree. He had lost a leg, which rested on the other side of the tree with the leggings and trouser legs still wrapped neatly around it. In addition to their ghoulish condition, I noted that both soldiers wore high-top leather hobnail shoes. That was the first time I had seen that type of Japanese footwear. All the enemy I had seen on Peleliu had worn the rubber-soled canvas split-toed tabi. We encountered some Okinawans, mostly old men, women and children. The Japanese had conscripted all the young men as labourers and a few as troops, so we saw few of them. We sent the civilians to the rear, where they were put into internment camps so they couldn't aid the enemy. These people were the first civilians I had seen in a combat area. They were pathetic. The most pitiful things about the Okinawan civilians were that they were totally bewildered by the shock of our invasion, and they were scared to death of us. Countless times they passed us on the way to the rear with fear, dismay, and confusion on their faces. The children were nearly all cute and bright-faced. They had round faces and dark eyes. The little boys usually had close-cropped hair, and the little girls had their shiny jet-black locks bobbed in the Japanese children's style of the period. The children won our hearts. Nearly all of us gave them all the candy and rations we could spare. They were quicker to lose their fear of us than the older people, and we had some good laughs with them. One of the funnier episodes I witnessed involved 2 Okinawan women and their small children. We had been ordered to halt and take 10, a 10-minute rest, before resuming our rapid advance across the island. My squad stopped near a typical Okinawan well constructed of stone, and forming a basin about 2 feet deep and about 4 feet by 6 feet on the sides. Water bubbled out of a rocky hillside. We watched 2 women and their children getting a drink. They seemed a bit nervous and afraid of us, of course, but life had its demands with children about, so one woman sat on a rock, nonchalantly opened her kimono top, and began breastfeeding her small baby. While the baby nursed, and we watched, the second child, about 4 years old, played with his mother's sandals. The little fellow quickly tired of this and kept pestering his mother for attention. The second woman had her hands full with a small child of her own, so she wasn't any help. The mother spoke sharply to her bored child, but he started climbing all over the baby and interfering with the nursing. As we looked on with keen interest, the exasperated mother removed her breast from the mouth of the nursing baby and pointed it at the face of the fractious brother. She squeezed her breast just as you would milk a cow and squirted a jet of milk into the child's face. The startled boy began bawling at the top of his lungs while rubbing the milk out of his eyes. We all roared with laughter, rolling around on the deck and holding our sides. The women looked up, not realizing why we were laughing, but began to grin because the tension was broken. The little recipient of the milk in the eyes stopped crying and started grinning too. "Get your gear on! We're moving out!" came the word down the column. As we shouldered our weapons and ammo and moved out amid continued laughter, the story travelled along to the amusement of all. We passed the 2 smiling mothers and the grinning toddler, his cute face still wet with his mother's milk. Moving rapidly toward the eastern shore, we crossed terrain often extremely rugged with high, steep ridges and deep gullies. In one area, a series of these ridges lay across our line of advance. As we laboured up one side and down the other of each ridge, we were tired but glad the Japanese had abandoned the area. It was ideal for defence. During another halt, we spent our entire break rescuing an Okinawan horse. The animal had become trapped in a narrow flooded drainage ditch about 4 feet deep. He couldn't climb out or move forward or backward. When we first approached the animal, he plunged up and down in the water, rolling his eyes in terror. We calmed him, slipped a couple of empty cartridge belts beneath his belly, and heaved him up out of the ditch. We had plenty of help, because Texans and horse lovers gravitated to the scene from all over our battalion, which ranged in columns along the valley and surrounding ridges. The city men looked on and gave useless advice. When we got the little horse out of the ditch, he stood on wobbly legs as the water dripped off him, shook himself, and headed for a patch of grass. No sooner had we washed the mud off the cartridge belts than the word came to move out. We didn't get any rest during that break, and we were tired, but we had the satisfaction of knowing that the little horse wouldn't starve to death bogged down in the ditch. The clear, cool weather compensated for our rapid advance over the broken terrain. Those of us with experience in the tropics felt as though we had been delivered from a steam room. The hills and ridges on Okinawa were mostly clay, but it was dry, and we didn't slip or slide with our heavy loads. Pine trees grew everywhere. I had forgotten what a delicious odour the needles gave off. We also saw Easter lilies blooming. Completing the initial assignment of the 1st Marine Division to cut the island in two, we reached the east coast in an area of marshes and what appeared to be large freshwater reservoirs. Offshore was a bay called Chimu-wan. We arrived on the afternoon of the 4th of April, some 8 to 13 days ahead of schedule. Our rapid movement had been possible, of course, only because of the widely scattered opposition. These first 4 days had been too easy for us. We were confused as to what the Japanese were doing. We knew they weren't about to give up the island without a fierce, drawn-out fight. And we didn't have to wait long to find out where the enemy was. Later that day, rumours began that the army divisions were meeting increasingly stiff opposition as they tried to move south. We knew that sooner or later we'd be down there with them in the thick of it. We also learned that our namesake company in the 7th Marines had been ambushed to the north of us near the village of Hisayona and had suffered losses of 3 killed and 27 wounded. Thus, despite the relative ease with which our division had moved across the centre of the island, the Japanese were still there and still hurting the Marines. The 1st Marine Division spent the remainder of April mopping up the central portion of Okinawa. Elements of the division, including the 3D Battalion, 5th Marines, conducted a shore-to-shore amphibious operation towards the end of the month to secure the eastern islands, which lay on the outer edge of Chimu-wan Bay. The purpose was to deny them to the Japanese as an operating base in the rear of the American forces, much the same reason 3-5 had assaulted Ngesebus during the fight for Peleliu. The 6th Marine Division moved north during April and captured the entire upper part of the island. The task wasn't easy. It involved a rough, costly 7-day mountain campaign against strongly fortified Japanese positions in the heights of Motobu Peninsula. Meanwhile, 3 army divisions were coming up short against fierce Japanese resistance in the Kakazu-Nishibaru ridgeline, the first of 3 main enemy defense lines in the southern portion of the island. Stretched from left to right across Okinawa, the 7th, 96th and 27th Infantry Divisions were getting more than they could handle and were making little progress in their attacks. Hardly had we arrived on the shore of Chimu-wan Bay than we received orders to move out. We headed inland and north into an area of small valleys and steep ridges, where we settled into a comfortable bivouac area and erected our 2-man pup tents. It was more like manoeuvres than combat. We didn't even dig foxholes. We could see Yontan Airfield in the distance to the west. Rain fell for the first time since we had landed 5 days earlier. The next day, our company began patrolling through the general area around our bivouac site. We didn't need the mortars because of the scattered nature of the enemy opposition. Stowing them out of the weather in our tents, those of us in the mortar section served as riflemen on the patrols. Mac, our new mortar section leader, led the first patrol I made. Our mission was to check out our assigned area for signs of enemy activity. Bergin was our patrol sergeant. I felt a lot more comfortable with him than with Mac. On a clear, chilly morning, with the temperature at about 60 degrees, we moved out through open country on a good, rock-surfaced road. The scenery was picturesque and beautiful. I saw little sign of war. We had strict orders not to fire our weapons unless we saw a Japanese soldier or Okinawans we were certain were hostile. No shooting at chickens and no target practice. "Mac, where we headed?" someone had asked before we left. "Hisayona," the lieutenant answered without batting an eye. "Jesus Christ, that's where K Company, 7th, got ambushed the other night," one of the new replacements said. "Do you mean us few guys are supposed to patrol that place?" "Yeah, that's right, Hood," Bergin answered. We had nicknamed a big square-jawed man from Chicago Hoodlum because of the notorious gangs of John Dillinger and others in that city during the days of Prohibition. My reaction on hearing our destination had been to thrust my Tommy gun toward another new man who wasn't assigned to the patrol and say, "Take this. Don't you want to go in my place?" "Hell no," he replied. So off we went, with Mac striding along like he was still in OCS back in Quantico, Virginia. The veterans among us looked worried. The new men, like Mac, seemed unconcerned. Because of the strange absence of anything but scattered opposition, some of the new men were beginning to think war wasn't as bad as they had been told it was. Some of them actually chided us about giving them an exaggerated account of the horrors and hardships of Peleliu. Okinawa in April was so easy for the 1st Marine Division that the new men were lulled into a false sense of well-being. We warned them, when the stuff hits the fan, it's hell. But they grew more and more sure that we veterans were snowing them. Mac didn't help matters either by his loud pronouncements of how he would take his kabar in his teeth and his .45 in hand and charge the Japanese as soon as one of our guys got hit. The April stay of execution tended to lull even the veterans into a state of wishful thinking and false security, although we knew better. Soon, however, our idyllic stroll on that perfect April morning was broken by an element of the horrid reality of the war that I knew lurked in wait for us somewhere on that beautiful island. Beside a little stream below the road, like a hideous trademark of battle, lay a Japanese corpse in full combat gear. From our view above, the corpse looked like a gingerbread man in a helmet, with his legs still in the flexed position of running. He didn't appear to have been dead many days then, but we passed that same stream many times throughout April and watched the putrid remains decompose gradually into the soil of Okinawa. I was thankful the windswept road, with the sweet, fresh smell of pine needles filling our nostrils, was too high for us to sense his presence in any way but visually. As we patrolled in the vicinity of Higaona, we moved through some of the area where Company K, 7th Marines, had been ambushed a few nights before. The grim evidence of a hard fight lay everywhere. We found numerous dead Japanese where they had fallen, bloody battle dressings, discarded articles of bloody clothing, and bloodstains on the ground indicated where Marines had been hit. Empty cartridge cases were piled where various Marine weapons had been. I remember vividly an Okinawan footpath across a low hillock where the Marine column apparently had been attacked from both sides. On the path were empty machine gun ammo boxes, ammo clips for M1 rifles, and carbine shell cases, discarded dungaree jackets, leggings and battle dressings, and several large bloodstains, by then dark spots on the soil. Scattered a short distance on both sides of the path were about a score of enemy dead. The scene was like reading a paragraph from a page of a history book. The Marines had suffered losses, but they had inflicted worse on the attacking Japanese. We saw no Marine dead. All had been removed when the relief troops had come in and aided K-3-7 to withdraw from the ambush. As I looked at the flotsam of battle scattered along that little path, I was struck with the utter incongruity of it all. There the Okinawans had tilled their soil with ancient and crude farming methods. But the war had come, bringing with it the latest and most refined technology for killing. It seemed so insane, and I realized that the war was like some sort of disease afflicting man. From my experience at Peleliu, I had unconsciously come to associate combat with stifling hot, fire-swept beaches, steaming mangrove-choked swamps, and harsh, jagged coral ridges. But there on Okinawa the disease was disrupting a place as pretty as a pastoral painting. I understood then what my grandmother had really meant when she told me as a boy that a blight descended on the land when the South was invaded during the Civil War. While a buddy and I were looking over the area, Bergin told us to check out a section of sunken roadway nearby. The sunken portion was about 30 yards long and about 10 feet deep. The banks were steep and sloping. Heavy bushes grew along their edges at ground level, so all we could see was the sky overhead and the sloping road in front and behind us. When we were about halfway along the sunken road, carbine shots rang out from where we had left Bergin and Mac. "Ambush!" snarled my buddy, a veteran with combat experience stretching back to Cape Gloucester. We went into a low crouch instinctively, and I put my finger on the safety catch of the Tommy. Hurrying over to the bank toward the sound of the shots, we scrambled up and peered cautiously through the bushes. We both knew we wouldn't have a chance if we got pinned down in that ditch-like road where we could be shot from above. My heart pounded, and I felt awfully lonely as I looked out. There, where we had left him, stood Mac in the farmyard, calmly pointing his carbine straight down toward the ground by his feet at some object we couldn't see. My comrade and I looked at each other in amazement. "What the hell?" my buddy whispered. We climbed out of the sunken road and went toward Mac as he fired his carbine at the ground again. Other members of the patrol were converging cautiously on the area. They looked apprehensive, thinking we were being ambushed. Bergin stood a short distance behind Mac, shaking his head slowly in disgust. As we came up, I asked Mac what he had fired at. He pointed to the ground and showed us his target, the lower jaw of some long-dead animal. Mac said he just wanted to see if he could shoot any of the teeth loose from the jawbone. We stared at him in disbelief. There we were, a patrol of about a dozen Marines, miles from our outfit, with orders not to fire unless at the enemy, in an area with dead Japanese scattered all over the place, and our lieutenant was plinking away with his carbine like a kid with a BB gun. If Mac had been a private, the whole patrol would probably have stuck his head in a nearby well, but our discipline was strict, and we just gritted our teeth. Bergin made some tactful remark to remind Mac he was the officer in charge of a patrol, and that the enemy might jump us at any time. Thereupon Mac began spouting off, quoting some training manual about the proper way for troops to conduct themselves on patrol. Mac wasn't stupid or incompetent. He just didn't seem to realize there was a deadly war going on, and that we weren't involved in some sort of college game. Strange as it seemed, he wasn't mature yet. He had enough ability to complete Marine Corps OCS, no simple task, but occasionally he could do some of the strangest things only a teenage boy would be expected to do. Once on another patrol, I saw him taking great pains and effort to position himself and his carbine near a Japanese corpse. After getting just the right angle, Mac took careful aim and squeezed off a couple of rounds. The dead Japanese lay on his back with his trousers pulled down to his knees. Mac was trying very carefully to blast off the head of the corpse's penis. He succeeded. As he exulted over his aim, I turned away in disgust. Mac was a decent, clean-cut man, but one of those who apparently felt no restraints under the brutalizing influence of war, although he had hardly been in combat at that time. He had one ghoulish, obscene tendency that revolted even the most hardened and callous men I knew. When most men felt the urge to urinate, they simply went over to a bush or stopped wherever they happened to be, and relieved themselves without ritual or fanfare. During the early part of that beautiful April in our happy little valley, while we veterans talked endlessly in disbelief about the lack of fighting, a few of us had a close view of a Japanese Zero fighter plane. One clear morning after a leisurely breakfast of K-rations, several of us sauntered up a ridge bordering our valley to watch an air raid on Yontan airfield. None of us was scheduled for patrols that day, and none of us was armed. We had violated a fundamental principle of infantrymen. Carry your weapon on your person at all times. As we watched the raid, we heard an airplane engine to our right. We turned, looked down a big valley below our ridge, and saw a plane approaching. It was a Zero flying up the valley toward us, parallel to and level with the crest of our ridge. It was moving so slowly it seemed unreal. Unarmed, we gawked like spectators at a passing parade as the plane came across our front. It couldn't have been more than 30 or 40 yards away. We could see every detail of the plane and of the pilot seated in the cockpit inside the canopy. He turned his head and looked keenly at our little group watching him. He wore a leather flight helmet, goggles pushed up on his forehead, a jacket and a scarf around his neck. The instant the Zero pilot saw us, his face broke into the most fiendish grin I ever saw. He looked like the classic cartoon Japanese portrayed in American newspapers of the war years, with buck teeth, eyes, and a round face. He grinned like a cat, for we were to be his mice. We were a fighter pilot's strafing dream, enemy infantry in the open with no anti-aircraft guns and no planes to protect us. One of my buddies muttered in surprise as the plane went on by to our left, Did you see that bastard grin at us? Where the hell's my rifle? It happened so fast, and we were all so astonished at the sight of a plane cruising by at eye level, we almost forgot the war. The Japanese pilot hadn't. He banked, climbed to gain altitude, and headed around another ridge out of sight. It was obvious he was coming back to rake us over. It would be difficult to avoid getting hit. No saviour was in sight for us. As we started to spin around and rush back down the ridge seeking safety, we again heard a plane. This time it wasn't the throb of a cruising engine, but the roar of a plane at full throttle. The Zero streaked past us, going down the valley in the opposite direction from which he had first appeared. He was still flying at eye level, and he was in a big hurry, as if the devil were after him. His devil was our saviour, a beautiful blue marine corsair. That incredible corsair pilot bore in right behind the Japanese as they roared out of sight over the ridge tops. The planes were moving too fast to see either pilot's face, but I'm confident the Emperor's pilot had lost his grin when he saw that corsair. On our patrols during April, we investigated many Okinawan villages and farms. We learned a lot about the people's customs and ways of life. Particularly appealing to me were the little Okinawan horses, really shaggy, oversized ponies. The Okinawans used a type of halter on those horses that I had never seen before. It consisted of 2 pieces of wood held in place by ropes. The wooden pieces on either side of the horse's head were shaped like the letter F. They were carved out of fine-grained brown wood and were about as big around as a man's thumb. A short piece of rope or cord held the pieces together across the front, and a rope across the top of the animal's head held the pieces in place on each side of the head, just above the opening of the mouth. 2 short ropes at the back of the wooden pieces merged into a single rope. When pull was exerted on this single rope, the wooden pieces clamped with gentle pressure against the sides of the animal's face above the mouth, and the animal stopped moving. This apparatus combined the qualities of a halter and a bridle without the need for a bit in the horse's mouth. I was so intrigued by the Okinawan halter that I took one off a horse we kept with us for several days and replaced it with a rope halter. My intention was to send the wooden halter home. I remember that a bright piece of red cord held the front ends together, so I put it into my pack. After the 1st of May, however, it seemed increasingly doubtful that I would ever get home myself, and my equipment seemed to get heavier as the mud got deeper. Regretfully, I threw away the halter. We grew quite attached to the horse our squad had adopted, and he didn't seem to mind when we slung a couple of bags of mortar ammo across his back. When the time came at the end of April for us to leave our little horse, I removed the rope halter and gave him a lump of ration sugar. I stroked his soft muzzle as he switched flies with his tail. He turned, ambled across a grassy green meadow, and began grazing. He looked up and back at me once. My eyes grew moist. However reluctant I was to leave him, it was for the best. He would be peaceful and safe on the slopes of that green, sunlit hill. Being civilized men, we were duty-bound to return soon to the chaotic netherworld of shells and bullets and suffering and death. Ugly rumours began to increase about the difficulties the army troops were having down on southern Okinawa. From high ground on clear nights, I could see lights flickering and glowing on the southern skyline. A distant rumble was barely audible sometimes. No one said much about it. I tried unsuccessfully to convince myself it was thunderstorms, but I knew better. It was the flash and the growl of guns. On the 13th of April, the 12th of April back in the States, we learned of the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Not the least bit interested in politics while we were fighting for our lives, we were saddened nonetheless by the loss of our president. We were also curious and a bit apprehensive about how FDR's successor, Harry S. Truman, would handle the war. We surely didn't want someone in the White House who would prolong it one day longer than necessary. Not long after hearing of Roosevelt's death, we were told to prepare to move out. Apprehension grew in the ranks. We thought the order meant the inevitable move into the inferno down south. On the contrary, it was to be a shore-to-shore amphibious operation against one of the eastern islands. We learned that Company K was to land on Takabanare Island, and that there might not be any Japanese there. We were highly skeptical. But so far, Okinawa had been a strange battle for us. Anything could happen. Our battalion boarded trucks and headed for the east coast. We went aboard Amtraks and set out into Chimu 1 to make the short voyage to Takabanare. The other companies of our battalion went after other islands of the group. We landed with no opposition on a narrow, clean, sandy beach with a large rock mass high on our left. The rock hill looked foreboding. It was a vantage point from which flanking fire could have raked the beach, but all went well, and we pushed rapidly over the entire island without seeing a single enemy soldier. After we moved across the island and found nothing but a few civilians, we recrossed the island to the beach where we set up defensive positions.